I've been at Brunel for 5 years this year, and when I came to Brunel, I think I was working on a novel called Umbrella that was the beginning of a trilogy of novels. Well, I didn't, when I was working on the novel, I didn't know it was a trilogy, but when I finished it and thought, well, what am I going to do next? Suddenly the idea for 2 other novels fell into my mind, so to speak. And so the first novel was called Umbrella, the second one's called Shark, which I wrote while I've been teaching here. And I'm going to be finishing the third novel in the trilogy, which is called Phone, early next year, and it'll be published in June of next year. So Brunel's been good to me. You know, I've kind of worked on a substantial midlife trilogy of novels here, rather than, you know, some people say, well, you come and teach in academia, you won't write. On the contrary, I found it incredibly stimulating here. I found the interaction with my colleagues and with the students very helpful, actually, for work, and so I don't take that view. Now, the trilogy of novels is concerned with the relationship between mental illness, technology, and war. And my theory is that each of the major conflicts of the last 100 years has introduced a new kind of madness to our society. And indeed that technology, which we tend to like to look at in our culture as being something that we cleverly invent, is really just kind of shit that happens to us. Now, to give you my example, the First World War, very, very puzzling in a certain way, why we should have a war that is essentially fought. There's a great military historian called John Keegan, and he talks a lot about what's called the killing zone on a battlefield, which is the area where people actually get killed. And the killing zone for the First World War was a long, snaking strip of ground that in some places was about a mile or even 2 miles wide, and in some places only 200 or 300 yards wide. It stretched all the way from the Belgian border in Flanders, all the way down to the Swiss border in the southeast of France. So, and that by 1914, when the British Expeditionary Force fought their first engagements in the brick stacks of Ypres, it was a fluid, fast-moving war. And by 1915, by the summer of 1915, it's worth thinking about this, the French army had lost more men than all Allied armies lost in the Second World War together. You know, if you ever want to criticize the French, or, you know, kind of, it was a very fashionable thing in Britain when I was young and still to regard the French as cowards and collaborators, you have to think about what their experience of the First World War was. It was devastating for the French, absolutely devastating. More men died at Verdun, over 1 million men died at Verdun in 11 months. All French soldiers. Anyway, 1915, this killing zone is in place. On either side you have 50 caliber machine guns. You have the British Lewis gun and the British Vickers machine gun. In one engagement during the First World War, I think I'm right about this, a British Vickers machine gun was fired continuously for 23 hours with only changing to fill up the water cooling, to cool the barrel and to change the barrels. I think they changed 4 barrels because they became warped from the heat of firing. But otherwise it was continuous firing, and it fired over, I think this is right, during that period, 750,000 rounds, one gun, okay? So in 1908, Henry Ford opened the first car production line for the Model T in Detroit. So it strikes me that what you see in Flanders is the sequel to mechanization itself, to mechanical production. The best way to think of the First World War is it's the impact of mechanized technology on humanity. Humanity doesn't invent it, it just comes, because what are the first most obvious consequences of mechanization? Cars and deaths. And they go hand in hand. There's only 6 years that separates the Model T production line from this great snaking assembly line of death that passes right across France in that way. And I was very interested in an illness that the late Oliver Sacks, the neurologist, wrote a marvelous book about called Awakenings, about these, and you might have seen the movie of it with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams that was made. So this was a disease called encephalitis lethargica. It was a brain disease that afflicted people at the end of the First World War. I mean, the first cases were reported in 1917. And the symptoms of this disease were like the human body had become a machine. They were things like what's called by neurologists festination, moving very, very quickly like this, or palilalia, repeating phrases, repeating phrases, repeating phrases, all kinds of tics like this, as if the human body had somehow become something that was a machine in that way. So I thought that was kind of odd. So my first novel centers on this cluster of illness, technology, and war. And then this novel, Shark, is centered on the Second World War, and specifically on an event that happened on the 30th of July, 1945, when the USS Indianapolis was cruising from, from Guadalcanal to Leyte in the Philippines. And this ship, the USS Indianapolis, was the last American ship to be sunk in the Second World War. It was attacked by a Japanese submarine, I-58, that fired 2 torpedoes at it. One of them hit the magazine, and the whole ship went up. It went down, I think, in 6 minutes. And there were 1,000 men on board the ship. And they went into the water, into the Pacific Ocean, South Pacific Ocean. And because of what was called in the colourful military vernacular of the time, a snafu, situation normal, all fucked up, they weren't logged as having not arrived at Leyte. So nobody knew the ship was missing. It was a screw up. Because they were within an hour's flying time and 4 hours sailing time of help, but they weren't found for 3 days. And when they were found after 3 days, I think only about 120 men came out of the water. And the rest of them had died from exposure, they died from drinking seawater and going crazy, but most of all they died from sharks. It was the biggest shark attack ever recorded in human history. And has anybody ever seen the movie Jaws? Yeah? You remember Quint, the shark fisherman, and you remember Hooper, the cuddly marine biologist played by Richard, what's he called? So it's a call and response literary festivals. Richard Dreyfuss. You remember the scene when they're on the Orca, Quint's shark fishing boat, and they have a kind of competitive duel of shark scars, you know, and they're sort of pulling up their trouser leg and saying, well, that was a Mako that got me on. And at one point, Quint, he pulls up his sleeve to show a shark, and Hooper sees he's got a tattoo on his arm, and he says, what's that tattoo? And he says, it's the Indianapolis. And of course, Hooper, being a shark specialist, knows the story. And says, you were on the Indianapolis, were you? And of course, that's why Quint has become this Ahab-like figure, because he was in the water for the 3 days with the men being killed by sharks. Now, what they don't really get into in the movie is what the Indianapolis was doing in that part of the Pacific then, when the ship had sailed only 3 weeks before from San Francisco. It had left San Francisco and it had sailed straight across the Pacific, making Hawaii in a record time. And it went straight on from Hawaii, heading in the same direction, aiming for somewhere called Tinian Island. And on Tinian Island, it offloaded the only cargo it carried, heavy cruiser with 1,000 men on board. The only cargo was a 12-foot cubed plywood box and a small lead-encased cylindrical container about this big. And what it was, as you've probably guessed, it was being delivered to something called the 509th Composite Division of the US Army Air Force. Has anybody got it yet? Yeah, you know what it is. It's the fissile material for Little Boy, the first atomic bomb that was ever dropped, and the bomb casing. And Tinian Island was the forward base for the Enola Gay, for the plane, the superfortress that bombed Hiroshima. This is how a novelist thinks, but I accept that it's perhaps an unusual way to think about things. Let's just imagine that Mother Nature, if she exists, objected to the release of all of that plutonium into her atmosphere and into our oceans, the first human-caused radioactive poisoning in our environment ever. Perhaps she objected so much that capriciously and arbitrarily she decided to punish the poor young men of the Indianapolis as a representative. It was a collective punishment against humankind. A collective and proleptic punishment, because the Indianapolis was sunk 4 days before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Okay? So that's the conceit out of which this novel grows. Something very, very strange happened out there in the Pacific. And I believe that ever since that bomb was dropped, humanity has been a little bit crazy. A little bit crazier than it was even before. There's been a certain psychotic edge to events since the 6th of August 1945, when, let us not forget, 125,000 people were killed in a fraction of a second. And I don't know, I mean, the consequences of the radio, and those were civilians, mind. They were not military personnel. And what I think happened really, and I think it's still going on now, there's a concept that comes from an anthropologist called Gregory Bateson. It's the idea of the double bind. And the idea of the double bind is when you place somebody in an impossible situation. It's rather like the catch-22 that comes out of the Second War as well. And it's often applied in psychology a lot. So, you know, a mother says to a child, a furious mother says to a small child, "I love you." And the child doesn't know what to think, right? The child is placed in an impossible situation because clearly the mother doesn't really love them at all, yeah? But the message is, the actual data content is that they do. And I think that's what mutually assured destruction in the Cold War was like for everybody. We've all grown up in a colossal double bind. Because on the one hand, we want to believe in our governments, believe in the benevolent nature of the state, particularly in democracies which we elect. And on the other hand, the government, and in this case it's your namesake, has her finger on the button now. And I don't know whether you heard our marvellous Prime Minister, who I can't help but admire for how, and I speak as a lifelong unilateral disarmer. In the Trident debate, when Mrs. May was asked whether she would be prepared to push a button that would kill, and I think it was Dennis Skinner, the notorious beast of Bolsover, that put the question to her, "Oh, Mr. Prime Minister, would you kill 125?" He knew the figure of the number of people who died at Hiroshima. Mrs. May said, "Yes, yes, I would." And actually, that is the kind of leader you want. But that's a leader who's placing you in a double bind. Mummy doesn't love you. Because if Mummy does push the button, then Vladimir's going to push the button too, and we're all brown bread. So we're all in a double bind. We're all in a situation where the institution that we wish to protect us is in fact liable to murder us. And that's kind of a crazy world we live in. And I think it all begins here in the South Pacific on the night of the 30th of July, 1945. So I'm just going to finish off by reading you a brief passage. Well, not that brief. In fact, it's colossally long, like all writers, given the opportunity to read from my own work. It can go on forever. It's like the scene in A Handful of Dust at the end. You're just going to be sort of... Now I've got to find the page, always the most difficult thing, because I've taken to writing books with no chapters. Why did I do that? Because it makes it very hard to find anything in them at all. Why did I start writing books like this? I realised that it's because of computers. Because actually text is all searchable now. Yeah? I also started writing books with cultural references in them that nobody will get at all. Okay? When you think about writing, any writing about the past, yeah? When you read a book about the First World War, for example, and you think, oh yeah, that's really what the First World War was about. Actually, when you stop to think about it, the writer has basically written about the things you already know in order to make it seem credible. You know, do you really know what was in the head of a young soldier going over the top in 1914? You don't even know what pants he was wearing. Yeah? You don't know what his digestion was like. I don't know about you, that normally conditions what my day's like. Yeah? You know, I think that a lot of writing about the past is actually the past we already know. It's not the real past, which is kind of utterly unknowable. And the reason is that the novel, as a traditional art form, has to be contained within the codex. This is its platform. So it needs to be comprehensible. It needs to be internally self-referential. You can't have stuff in it that people don't really know, because that's going to ruin their reading experience. But we don't really read novels in that way anymore. We have different forms of knowledge technology that enable us to go right through the text and find. So why do novels still try and pretend that we don't have computers? It's kind of weird. Can't last for long. So this is written from the point of view of a young man called Claude, who is on the USS Indianapolis when it sunk. Claude unties the tapes of his life vest, and the kid, some poor stupid hick like all the rest, raises his hands automatically so they slide down and out of the armholes. You're welcome. And would Sir like to try another sports coat? The hands are poised for a moment. Claude sees there's no skin or flesh on them at all, only cooked tendons stretched over white florets of knuckle bones. Then it's the last roll of the dice, my friend, and they're gone. Already 10 feet down, sinking fast, the kid's long-sleeved denim shirt twirls about him. His bell-bottom dungarees whir, and his pillbox hat oscillates, a white dot hopping from word to word across the sea's screen. Talk about the moon, floating in the sky, looking at a lily on a lake. The kid is 20 feet down now, his arms up and circling, his feet down and revolving the other way. His hips swing as he hula-hulas into the deep. It doesn't seem so very deep due to the amazing clarity of the water. Claude experiments, turning his whole head because his eye sockets are filled with gritty sand. He sees the sea turn from green to aquamarine to cobalt blue to silvery to silver white, and then vanish completely as I push my head up her skirt. Finest ear protectors a fellow can get. Flesh-filled nylons fitted snug to the head and dried with talc. The kid's maybe 40 feet down now, yet his dancing, plummeting body can still be clearly seen. Happy talk, keep talking, happy talk. At Wright-Patterson Field, combat veterans had told Claude that when their parachutes collapsed, falling men spun, even as the ship they'd bailed out of flipped up on its wing and spun away from them, while the Kraut fighter that had scored the hit wheeled away too. So everywhere in the sky could be seen spinning things. Talk about the moon. Claude supposes if the sinking kid could only tip his head back, he'd see my face floating in the sky. But really, it's too late for that. The kid must be nearing full fathom friggin' 5, and the sun rays, which Claude sees flicker-fingering boots, tin cans, and other slowly descending debris, can no longer touch him. The kid has almost reached the Emerald City's limits. Claude wonders what sort of a how'd you do he'll get from the welcoming committee that circles him, their long grey bodies zigging, zagging, and circling evasively. What are their names? Ah, yes, Ivan Shark, Fury Shark, Admiral Himakito, that chink shitbird Fang, and the sinister Barracuda. There's obviously no possibility of Claude warning the kid, let alone saving him, but for his own satisfaction at least, he wishes he'd had the patience to decipher that day's codograph, a useless mishmash of letters and numerals, as he watches the first inquisitive shark nuzzle the kid's belly, only spools through his own soggy head. AM 85 9R 45 HJ 88. At least, Claude thinks, I've taken my vitamins. And he feels for the morphine syrettes he took from the emergency packs in the rafts, lashed to the bulkhead by the radio room. Reassuringly, they're still in the button-down pocket of his shirt. But how long can it be before the seawater happy talks its way up the hypos and ruins all those healthy vitae minds, all mine, this food, those other lunkheads, the green hands running round like they were after coups, and the sad sack sailors trying to corral all those farm boys, prairie boys, and banjo-picking freaks so as to herd 'em over the side. None of them had the smarts to pick up any supplies before they took the dive. Yes, Claude snickers to himself, they're all lesser men. Men who didn't volunteer for the secret squadron, which is why they mostly flipped their wigs when the torpedoes hit. Those who didn't flipped them when they saw their shipmates flying towards them across the tilting deck, the fleshy streamers flayed from their arms and legs, flapping in the hot air blasting from the burning fuel. Flipped them at the grotesque sight, the skin angels in flight, behind them flames flaring from the smokestack. Flipped them as the skin angels flocked to the fantail, where, too crazed by pain to recall the layout of their own ship, if they'd known it to begin with, they slithered about in its dying blood, bilge water, piss and turds from the heads, melted ice cream, and still fizzing soda from the dumb gidunk stand before launching themselves, screaming over the taffrail. Claude had seen them when he was on board, their fledgling wings spread in the hellish light. He'd seen still more of them once he was struggling in the water as the mass of the sinking ship dragged him back. Although shocked by his searing slide down the hull and the cold impact of the waves, Claude realized either his abandonment of the ship had taken a fraction of the time it seemed, or there must be a great host of skin angels. For there they'd been, high above him, each one silhouetted against the low scudding clouds for a couple of seconds, then launching into the air, managing maybe 2 or 3 futile wing beats before being swatted by the Indies' slowly revolving screws. Quick, Henry, the flit! And crumpling among all the other black flies into the sticky pool of fuel oil that lay, molasses, on the heaving waves. Waves that now cradle Claude so tenderly. Embrace me, you irreplaceable you, raising him up, then easing him gently down. Best not, Claude thinks, get too far down, 'cause then I'll find myself with roister doister, little oyster, down in the slimy sea. You ain't so different lying on your shell bed to the likes of little old me. Excepting that, roister doister, you're somewhat moister than I would like to. What the fuck did you do that for? The dumb Polak, whose name is Gorecki or something like that, pulls Claude's head from the water, tearing the sweetly salty sheets from his shell bed. Neptune's muffled subaquatic realm is conquered by this, the hurting disk of the noonday sun, the long, hard swell of the open ocean, and on the slope of that swell, the disintegrating chain of men Claude has deprived of a link by untying the kid's life vest and letting him sink. So just to give you a little illustration of what I'm talking about here, okay? So you may have noticed I write in a slightly different style. I don't write with an impersonal third-person narrator. I write with what is called monoperspectival narration. So you're sort of in the character's head, but you can only interpret the world through him. Okay, so I'm trying to get inside the head of a young man in the Pacific Ocean in 1945, an American. Would you know all of his references? Would you know, for example, what is he going on about? He's watching the ship has been upended. Well, it hasn't been upended, it's gone up like this. The back of the ship is called the fantail, and all of the ratings have gathered on the uppermost portion of the ship. When they jump off the ship, and this actually happened, the screws, the propellers of the vessel are still turning. So as they come off the ship, Claude sees them first as being what he thinks of as skin angels, because the heat from the burning ship has stripped the flesh from their bodies, and it's forming these streamers of skin. So he sees them as angels. When they jump off the boat, the revolving screw hits them and knocks them and into the oily water. He says molasses. It looks like molasses, the water. And he sees them as flies being swatted for a minute. So what comes into his head at that point is, quick, Henry, the flit. Right, flit was an insect repellent, and that was its marketing slogan in the America of the 1940s, okay? So it was a bit like for mash get smash, or, you know. But how would we know that? How would you know what was in the head of a man in 1945 in terms of the immediate cultural references that he might draw on or interpret his experience? Which is why I put it to you that most of the period fiction you've been reading your entire lifetime is utter bullshit. Thank you.